go? Well, good morning and welcome to the November 2nd, 2018 meeting of the DNA Subcommittee. I'm Dwight Adams, also present are Drs. Bieber, Eastman, Kidd, Gettings, and Sozer. That does constitute a quorum. The subcommittee would also like to welcome Jill Dooley as the new director of the Office of Forensic Services, and we all congratulate you on your new position. You've all received a draft agenda for today's meeting. Do I have a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Dr. Bieber, seconded by Dr. Eastman. All in favor, uplifted hand, please. Unanimous. You have also received a draft copy of the minutes from the August 3rd, 2018 meeting. Are there any questions or comments related to those minutes? Hearing none, do I have a motion to approve the minutes? Dr. Gettings? A second?
Seconded.
Dr. Eastman? All in favor, signify with the uplifted hand. Another unanimous vote. Next item on the agenda is for accreditation and laboratory updates. Excuse me.
I believe there was the May 11th, 2018 minutes were approved as well because there wasn't a quorum from the last meeting.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
Just want to bring that to your attention.
May 11th, you are correct. I missed that on the agenda. We also need to approve the May 11th, 2018 minutes. Do I have a motion to approve those minutes?
Make the motion.
Dr. Sozer, seconded by Dr. Eastman. All in favor? Lifted hand.
One abstention. I was not present.
2 abstentions. Drs. Bieber and Gettings were not present. Okay, thank you for that update. The next item is for accreditation and laboratory updates. Members of the laboratories will be available by telephone or in person if you have any questions. The first update will be the Erie County Central Police Services Forensic Laboratory.
Is the director present?
No, but you can reach your vehicle if you have questions.
I just have some general questions about some of the issues that were conforming with comments or conforming with recommendations. Starting on page 13 of our binder. Excuse me, page 27 of our binder. In red at the bottom. Page 13 of their document.
Forensic Lab, this is Michelle.
I'm Michelle. It's Shelley with the subcommittee. They have a few questions for you.
Okay, great, thanks.
Shelley, this is Fred Bieber, and on page 13 of the document, there, item 4.11.2, there's a comment that your lab was conforming, but there was a comment at page 21 of your document. There's another one, 5.2.2.1. On the very next page, page 22 of your document, item 5.2.2.2, conforming with comment. Could you help us understand? And there's also one on page 34.
Let me see if I can call one of them guys and transfer them to you.
All right.
All right, thanks, bye.
When is on
We're having,
page 30.
we can hear him and see him, but he's having a hard time hearing and seeing us, so.
We can't get any video, and it is difficult to hear you. It's my understanding he's looking at all of the conforming with comments. Is that right?
And there are also a couple
Hello.
resolved nonconformities.
I can't see a thing. My monitor's not on, and I can't hear anything.
Do we want to mute him?
Let's pause just a moment and try to get the technical issues
Michelle,
worked out.
we're having some difficulty with technology.
That's fine, we understand.
Is there somebody on the more?
Yeah,
I think
36 was
John is on the phone.
Report? Because it's his. I suppose.
Yeah, it's his hand.
I don't have.
I didn't really pay much. This was the cocaine issue.
Yeah.
A couple of them on cocaine. The training ones were the ones that
Root cause.
Michelle should be able to hear us. And that one too. She should be able to hear you better over the phone with that, but
Sure.
I don't think we resolved that yet.
Are you ready, Michelle?
So what do you want me to do?
Yes, we're here.
Okay, could you go to page 13 of your document? This is the 4.11.2, conforming with comment. I'd like to know what updated training and root cause analysis your team has implemented based on that inspection report.
Yeah, on this conforming with comment, we have 5 analysts that are taking
He's not on there.
DNAB assessor training starting on Monday of next week. It's a 5-day training course. And we also have another supervisor who will be taking the same training in February, which that course will include some root cause aspects to it. And then we are continuing to watch
And I can't hear anything that's being
ANAB
said on your end.
website to see if there are any future webinars available associated with root cause analysis. So this is kind of a continuing education concern that we will be addressing over time.
Could you jump to page 21 in the lower right, item 5.2.2.1, accreditation requirement? Could you comment on the broader range of general knowledge that's been recommended to your group?
Yes, this one they suggested that we add fingerprints to the training manuals, and that has been done in all of the technical sections.
And the very next item also states the lab would benefit from updating your training programs.
Yes, that's been done in all of the technical sections too. All of them have updated to include testimony prior to authorization.
Including moot court?
Yes.
Okay.
Call-in number or no?
I'm trying to find out.
Because that'd be,
Yeah.
figure this thing out another thing. I can just call in. There's no reason I have to.
Adding latent print familiarization aspect, was that as a result of some evidence that was
That's right.
handled in not the ideal way for fingerprint identification later on, or was that just a general comment, or was it the result of some actual case?
It was a general comment. We typically don't receive evidence that is needed for fingerprint analysis because we don't do fingerprint analysis here. That's done by the police agencies, or it's taken to an outside source, but they just thought it would be helpful to include that.
Okay, thanks.
Other questions? Comments? Do I have a motion to issue a binding recommendation to the Commission on Forensic Science to renew the New York accreditation of the Erie County Central Police Services Forensic Laboratory in the discipline of biology for the time period concurrent
Yeah,
with their
rather than
ANAB
screw with this thing, let's
accreditation?
just do that.
Yeah.
All right, thanks.
I make the motion?
Dr. Sozer, do I have a second?
Second.
Dr. Kidd? All in favor? It's unanimous. The remaining updates are for information. The remaining updates are for informational purposes, and no vote will be required. In the agenda, Nassau is next, but I'm going to save them to last. I think there were some train issues.
They're here.
Oh, are they?
Thank you.
Okay. Glad you're here. Well, we'll begin with Nassau County Division of Forensic Services. Questions or comments?
Documents are in the second binder if you're looking. This one.
Oh,
Not sure you have a mic.
oh, I don't think I need one.
I just had a question on, what happened in your findings. I looked at the findings, and the
They're
mixture.
vague, right? So first, this is our, we just had our assessment.
Mhm.
We're not beyond the 30 days that we may or may not appeal any of these nonconformities. So the first nonconformity that really dealt more with the documentation of the technical lead for the reviews of the policies and procedures and all that. So we document that in our management review every year. We've been doing that the same since 2015. Prior to that, we used to have the technical lead send an email. When we became a multidisciplinary laboratory, we started documenting it in the lab management review. So they had an issue with the fact that it was minutes from that management review meeting, and the summary of that meeting was addressed to the tech lead from the quality managers, and it wasn't from the tech lead to the quality managers.
Uh-huh.
And it says, even though it says that all the revisions have been put in production, suggestions for improvement, and that everything has been reviewed by the director and the audits too, it does not say approves, even though he approves all the documents. So they have an issue. So we'll
Footer
go
has
back to a
approval
memo.
of area 2 for it with the date and
Uh-huh.
conditions.
Uh-huh.
We're gonna write
We'll
memos.
just go back to
Yeah.
after the management review, the tech lead will write a memo.
Are you appealing that?
We want to appeal both, but the second one's gonna take a little bit longer to
Yeah.
explain. But I think it's just easier to not appeal and just go. Sometimes it's just
You know,
easier to
because
do
then
it.
you're, first you have the 30 days, and then you appeal, and then it's 60 more days for a response, and then it's 60 more days. You don't really appeal.
In a way, I like our method since 2015 better because there's actual communication rather than assuming that somebody read a memo on the other side of email.
And this is part of their off-site assessment, as well as we have had external FBI QA in 2016 who have not had issue with this in the past.
Hello.
We haven't changed anything. But, you know, I guess from the literal, maybe, yeah. I feel it's in the spirit.
Hello.
Definitely happened. If you look at our documentation, I don't think you would feel that it was not happened.
So on the other issue, how did that, I mean, they reviewed a validation study? So the validation study was not approved in the QAS document? What is the discrepancy between what you're doing and what was in your validation?
You're gonna have to bear with me on this one. I'm gonna try to
But
do
so
it with a
again,
smile on
we-
my face too.
You know, this was, for our Ys, we had an external review in 16, and then the only reason for the new validation for Wi-Fi was because we went from
Plus.
3130 to 3500.
Not plus. So we've relied on an ABI format with a 2 and 3 person mix, and you know we decided when it came time for Global Filer to use an outside agency, and I enjoyed ABI's structure, content, and so forth. I thought it was complete validation, so we took on that format of 2 and 3 person mixes. So I'll just get right to it. So essentially, we interpret major components in mixtures of as many individuals as long as there's a clear major, but we don't define clear major. The validation shows 2 and 3 person mixes, 5 to 1, 2 to 1, and then with 2 people, we just go straight out all the way to 20 to 1. It's, after 20 to 1, I don't think it's even an issue whether that's interpretable or not. Their opinion was that we don't really state what the clear major is. So I said, to define it, no mathematical permutations, it's apparent. And then I had shown them that, where do I stop if I do the 5 to 1, 5 to 1 to 1, and then continue to add minor components to 7, 8, 9 people? I said, if I have a case that has 10 people, which I'm exaggerating at this point. A good example is, and I had them bring a case in, it was a revolver. And my example was, if you have a firearm that has victims' blood, and X amount of gang members used this gun in the past, blood over touch is going to be just a mountain compared to the minor components. And I'm just, in the most layman terms, I'm just trying to address this. So I brought the case in. Here's the major, here are the minors. Even if we stack the minor, it wouldn't have come close. So I said, no problem. I will revalidate with clear majors, and I will go out to 5-person for Autosomal. And I think I'm just doing 3 or 4 with YSTRs. The way our manuals are written basically state that we don't do mixes of greater than 4 components for CPI. So if we hit 4 people, we don't do the interpretations unless there's a clear major. My revisions now state what a clear major is. Am I thrilled that I have to now go and create all these majors and then take them? And what I've decided to do is take these samples as an addendum, the 5 to 1, the 5 to 1 to 1, the 5 to, you guys can do it as long as you need to do it, but up to 5 people, to start at 62 picograms, because that's where we see a significant amount of loss. Their second issue was, well, in compromised templates, compromised mixed templates, the major isn't at an optimal concentration. You don't know how that major acts at a lower concentration, and how does the minor affect it? And I said, well, it's relative. It's just going to reduce the amplification of the minor products even less. They might fall under AT if I reduce that template, but I don't expect the major of a 5 to 1 to ever flip. So then we started looking at YSTR cases, and they felt that they were interpretive inconsistencies. In the end, after a 3-hour discussion, it turned out that they were under the impression that we took a composite of 4 samples and created a profile. It wasn't the case, they were just different fingernails, so I had to explain that. Then the issue was that at the duplicate location of Y, 385, we interpreted that location, and I was dumbfounded. I said, there's just no way that anyone would have interpreted this in this laboratory based upon our SOPs, based upon our replicative process, which I think is 10 times better than revalidating and then going back to a validation to compare your casework to, when I can revalidate casework and say we're not doing reps anymore, because now we have the casework data. We handle stochastic situations by replicate analysis, and if the major stay major, then we interpret it. It turned out she was on the wrong stat sheet, so we did interpret 385 for a case, but she was on the wrong stat sheet. It was on the correct stat sheet for that particular sample. We made that location inconclusive, so they were fine with that. I thought it was done. The next day they came back, and I think the issue was, well, you don't look at your mixtures at a low enough concentration. So I'm going to do 5 to 1 to 1, 2 to 1 to 1, and again, up to 5 in autosomal, up to 3 in Ys, and just go to the end of our titration and show that the major in a 5 to 1 is still going to remain major at down to 20 picograms. I might be going a little lower than 20, but having a little technical difficulty. I was actually going to let you know what the range was.
Could you explain to me what your lab does with a pistol when it comes in with regard to DNA sampling? How does your team swab it or sample it?
Dependent upon the circumstances. Biology may get it first, or biology may get it last. If it's a situation where it's a close range, and there's stippling, there's a muzzle stamp. We're hoping that there might be blowback. We don't want to have that sent to ballistics for firing because obviously we don't want to deplete one form of forensic evidence over another. I think they're all. So ballistics can be, or an operability test can be done prior to anything else, if the circumstances of the case hold true. Generally, it comes to Leighton first. Leighton does their work because now we can actually see. We're using dyes, we're not using dust. So we can locate the smears, we can locate the prints, and target particular areas that we swab. So we do swab firearms ourselves. Crime scene does it. In terms of
what
casings,
do you swab, and how many swabs do you take?
we generally do the trigger area as one. We do the grip as a second area. If it comes to casings, what we do is we generally will get a order of consumption from the DA's office or the PD if a DA is not involved in the case. We would combine casings in a situation where the casings are of the same caliber.
I have a general concern not about what you've just said, but about some of the labs I've visited around the country or testimony I've been participating in, where some labs will swab many areas of the firearm, typically a pistol or a handgun, and they'll combine these swabs into a single extract. And I'm very concerned that you, the editorial you, not you individually, could be creating a mixture where none existed. And it's certainly true that the person who handles a cartridge and loads it into a magazine or to a cylinder in a revolver may not be the one who handled the pistol or pulled the trigger in the instant case. How does your lab handle that issue when you're swabbing for DNA?
Again, as we target specific areas, and we had this discussion in Connecticut about the concerns with firearms and so forth. I think it was one of the things I mentioned at the STR Mix user meeting.
Right.
We try to target specific areas of the firearm, but I'm not saying that we haven't swabbed casings and created one swab from casings.
Okay.
One swab. We don't combine swabs from different areas, and we actually try and discourage doing DNA analysis on this evidence just for that reason.
Especially
we make
CPWs.
it very, very clear to the district attorney and the case detectives that just because you have a profile on there doesn't mean that's the last person that had it in their hands or they're associated.
Generally, firearms
This I'm relieved to hear this. This may be common knowledge and common practice in the great state of the Empire State of New York, but it's not true in other places.
We do our best not to combine evidence. In fact, with bio and blood, we use spatter interpretation prior to even considering combining swabs.
I mean, usually they need special approval to get that analysis
Mixed.
done.
My bottom line, and I think I'm preaching to the choir, mixtures are challenging enough, let alone let us not create them where they didn't exist.
Right. It's like taking 8 cigarette butts from an ashtray and saying, I'm going to combine them because I don't have enough DNA for one application.
Thank you.
But that's a little different than what the situation is with having to go and redo some validations. I wanted to appeal it because I think my SOPs are very clear. They agreed that they were clear, but my main issue was I need someone here to tell me that there is no concern of interpretive errors in my cases. And then finally, on record, I said, can you just let me know if I have interpretive situations? And the answer was no.
Right, I saw that.
It's a matter of having to expand my validation. I'll do a test, but I don't have any consideration on dropping the replicate amp. Because again, just because a 5-to-1 and a 2-to-1 hold true in validation, with unknown samples, it just doesn't work that way. What the concentration of minor contributors are, or major, for that fact. So we do think the replicate process is a better driving force than is looking at validation at 5-to-1 to 1-to-1 to 1, and so forth at minimal template.
So it was the same issue with the Y-Filer Plus?
The same
and,
thing.
And
Yeah.
Global
It's
Filer?
Y-Filer, we're not on Plus yet.
Oh, Y-Filer and Global Filer?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
But this was a 3-hour discussion.
I can
Literally,
imagine.
it really was a 3-hour discussion.
And then they were up till 3 a.m. that night, and then finally concluded that it should be a fine.
And what they're utilizing is really the 2015 board decision. That's the language.
It's clear. It's clear.
There. But again, that has been evaluated before with the same validation by external people without issue.
The comment, and I believe the comment was, and correct me if I'm wrong, is they were pleased to see the stability of our interpretations, that we were consistent in our interpretations. If we remove locations in one situation, we were continuous in other cases. That's why I was a bit taken back, because I figured we're still using the ABI validation, but again, it's only 2 and 3 persons, and we do calculate mixes on greater than 2 to 3 people, but only, and I hate to say the word clear major at this point now, only in situations where I don't need to use mathematical permutations to make a deduction.
Help me understand one last time, what's the downside of appealing? Explaining what you've just done very clearly. What's the worst thing that could happen by...
Generally, appeals are never won, so it's just easier to move forward. The worst part of this is come January, we're going online with probabilistic genotyping, so all of this goes away. I could appeal it and maybe get some time and then say, okay, look, we're no longer online with it, but it's just the right way to do it. I may appeal it. I mean, it's not fair to me to say, should I appeal this to this panel? I might consider it again. It's the reason why this hasn't been written up is because I leave one day, we're not going to appeal it. I come in the next morning, we're going to appeal it. And it's flip-flop quite a few times. It's quite a bit of analysis to do. It's about 36 times 3 samples. If I have to use a couple more global filing kits and Y kits in order to get through this, then I will. I don't think the information that I'm going to be providing my examiners is going to provide any substance for their future interpretations. That's my opinion. It may be wrong.
My feeling generally is that if you think you have grounds to appeal, you should do it because it's healthy for the system itself, right? It's healthy for ANAB to see those types of cases and that it was worth it to you to appeal it. But I think I would say that to anybody in the situation where you're so on the fence about it, I would think that it's worth doing.
I mean, I truly do. It's just the fact that in January we're just going to new technology and it just to have to go back and forth. Now if they say no, you have to go back and do it. Now I'm January 30th and we've already abandoned the old technology. Now I'm going to sit here and revalidate.
So then could that be the remediation, that you just abandoned it in general? I mean, if you wait long enough.
That's funny because you and I have the same thought process. You might have to get her to agree with that too. The person sitting right next to me because she doesn't think I'm talking about it. Right?
Would it be worthwhile just asking them if that would be a remediation?
If the appeal extends into that.
Good point.
I could. Again, my opinion now is I should appeal this, but I'm going to walk 12 city blocks and probably change my opinion.
One last question from me. How does this affect any ongoing casework or recent?
It doesn't, because there are no interpretive issues. It's just my validation according to these assessors, not the last assessors that looked at my validation, feel that it doesn't support my case interpretations. I don't have a 5-person mix with majors. And if I'm going to continue to do that, then I should have some representation in the world of validation. My issue is when I have, and maybe I shouldn't be saying this to you, but that case with 6 individuals, but there's victim's blood and there's a cornucopia or an allelic ladder of peaks at the analytical threshold. Even if I stacked the minor peaks, it wouldn't have met the RFU value of even one of the sister alleles of the heterozyte. But if I have to show it, my feeling is I'm looking for evidence to either exonerate or exculpate someone. I'm not going to say I'm just not going to review it or interpret it because it's greater than 6 people in my validation. And we don't normally see 6 people. I'm still exaggerating from the fact that I felt that the evidence that I provided was sufficient, and I thought the SOP itself was enough but it wasn't. And I don't believe the case that I showed either was enough.
Other questions or comments related to Nassau County?
Just have a question on your quant trio. Do you have a low end below which you won't amplify?
Yes.
What's your threshold?
For YSTRs, we came up a bit because casework showed that down to 15 picograms, there was just no success. And I'm off the top of my head because I'm having trouble promoting the desk, but we go as far down with Global Filer to 15, and YSTRs, I believe we've increased that threshold to either 30 or 60 picograms, but that's something that I would have to verify. So we do have a high and low end.
Thank you.
Anything else? Thank you.
Thank you.
Next up will be New York City OCME, Department of Forensic Biology. Are there questions or comments for OCME? Dr. Gettings?
So we have the letter about the implementation of the Andy 60 Rapid ID system. I think the wording is for exemplars and human ID purposes. So I don't do this type of analysis, so I'm not familiar with the wording, so I'm not clear if that means evidence samples or reference samples only.
For missing persons work, it will be for reference samples. I suppose it could be for evidence if it's a product of conception, but in general, it's not allowed. Rapid DNA is not allowed according to the code of schools and schools for evidence samples.
Dr. Erie?
Tim, you mentioned you're getting the MySeq FGX instrument. Are you planning to use the software that's available for phenotype prediction or ancestry?
Not for the first phase. We're going to only use it for mitochondrial DNA. We have a number of thousand of mitochondrial DNA samples that we're going to run through it.
Yeah.
And then once, again, NDIS comes on board with phenotyping and STR, well, we won't come on board with phenotyping, but with STR analysis, then we'll start exploring that. But we haven't really explored software too much beyond the mito realm.
Thank you.
Other questions, comments? Thank you, Tim. Onondaga County Center for Forensic Sciences is next. Questions or comments?
Nothing.
Do we need to call?
I have nothing.
Yep.
I was simply going to commend them for the number of validations they've gotten done for such a small lab.
You can still do that.
Okay.
So go ahead.
Okay.
Have to
I'd ask them how they do it.
have to commend the auditor for, like, that's a lot of validations to review.
Hello, this is Kathy.
Hi, Kathy. It's Shelley with the DNA Subcommittee.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Catherine Gettings would like to see you.
Hi, Kathy. How are you doing?
Hi, good, how are you?
Good. We were debating whether even to call you, but I just wanted to say that we're very impressed with the number of validations that you all completed in a fairly short amount of time and that you had no findings on your audits. So I was wondering if you just wanted to speak to how such a small lab was able to accomplish all of that.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that. It was a lot of work. We were fortunate enough to get a new position
about a year ago, which was a validation specialist. So I think that helped because, we had a person that was more dedicated to validation rather than everyone else trying to do it in their spare time. So that was part of it, and part of it was it was important for us. We wanted to make sure we could get as many things done so that it could be inspected, prior to us doing a lot of casework. In case someone had an issue with it, we would be able to go back and fix it if necessary. So thank you, though. I really appreciate that.
And is that person that you hired still with you? Is that a full-time employee?
Yes, she is. Mm-hmm.
Okay, wonderful.
Anything else? Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you all very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Next is Suffolk County Crime Laboratory. Questions or comments? Dr. Stover?
Yeah, I just had a question on page 261.
We're going to call them right now.
I don't even think I don't know if we need to call them, but are they, because there's a new sheet in the front, or relatively new sheet in the front, they don't write any findings or NA at the end. And I think, Allison, you've made a comment in the past about auditors
Don't leave it blank.
not leaving it blank. So that's my comment, that we don't, that
Just say there was.
NA or, yeah.
We can call A&AB because you had that as a topic last time, so we have
This is on the QAS audit. Was this an internal?
I
It's
think
an
it's an
internal QAS audit.
Because this is a similar question as last time.
Yeah.
That was for A&AB.
Yeah. But for this one, it
Was internal.
Internal QAS. If just people would just write in there.
If it's not
No findings or something.
Then maybe we should just call them. If it was internal, then we should just say that to them.
Wait and call. Joe?
Good morning, Ms. Connie Dinkle.
Hi, Connie. It's Shelley with the DNA Subcommittee. They have a few comments for you.
Okay.
Just one comment I have. This is Allison Eastman. In Appendix A of your internal QAS audit, if you could, in the future, don't leave the findings blank. Just say there were no findings.
Okay.
That's all my only comment.
Okay, great. I'll make sure that I pass that on to the DNA supervisor and the tech lead.
That was it.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Connie.
Yeah, sure thing. Have a good day.
You too.
And our last update will be Westchester County Division of Forensic Science. Are there questions or comments?
No, not for me.
Hearing none. Okay. Next item on the agenda is old business. Jill, are you prepared to give an update on the partial match program?
I am. There has been no changes since our last update, so the last partial match letter issued was in 2005. So there's no additional update on that.
Okay. And then familial searching.
An update on familial searching is that we have received 2 new applications and 1 resubmission since the last update. 2 additional searches have been performed, and the results of the 3rd is still pending. So we have had the 2 trainings with the law enforcement to release those results. We have 8 applications now in the search queue, and of the 4 pending applications that are still awaiting review, 1 is pending case eligibility determination, 2 are pending supplemental information requests, and 1 is pending commissioner approval.
Comments or questions from anyone?
So the searches that have been completed, have any names been turned over to law enforcement?
Results have been released, yes.
There have been some.
Other questions? Thank you, Jill. The next updates relate to new technologies. And Department of Health is on the agenda. Ann, would you like to come up to the table? This is Ann Walsh.
So my understanding is that I'm requested to be here just to describe Department of Health's role and things and how we're looking at some of the new issues that are coming down the line. So just because there are some new people here, I thought I'd just sort of walk through a little bit of the history of what we do. So basically, the Department of Health has historically had authority over the regulation of clinical laboratories. And that's obviously to ensure, a quality product is going to the physician who's interpreting those results in the historical sense. And then in 1994, when New York State was working out how the DNA database was going to work and also trying to ensure quality testing, the issue was discussed between DCJS and the Department of Health, and it was decided that Department of Health should retain authority over labs that do forensic DNA testing for the purposes of identification. But there was an exemption made for any local or state government labs, any local or state governments that were looking to have evidence examined for the purposes of identification in a criminal case. So basically the way it splits out for the most part is if you are the Forensic Investigation Center or one of the county labs or the OCME, you're regulated by the Commission on Forensic Science and you folks, and if you're a private entity or even a nonprofit entity, and you aren't specifically exempted from this public health law, which is Public Health Law 571, then you come under the regulatory authority of the New York State Department of Health. And there's a process for applying for a permit in forensic identity. In some cases, there are labs that are interested only in doing forensic paternity. In that case, they also need a forensic identity permit, even though they're only doing paternity cases. So the definition of a clinical lab in the public health law includes laboratories which are analyzing material from the human body for the purposes of identification. And so the issue has come up over the years of, what do you classify as a method that's going to be identifying versus what's an investigative lead. And I know in the discussions that we've had internally regarding laboratories such as Parabon that are doing the genomic genealogy, that was an issue. And initially, when we were just looking at the question of phenotype analysis with hair color or whatnot, we thought, maybe we could consider it just investigative lead. But essentially, as time went on, the discussions developed, and then we actually saw on Parabon's website that there's a statement that in some cases they can actually identify an individual using this methodology. Then it obviously comes under the category of being a method that can be identifying and therefore requires a permit from the Department of Health. So the general process is that they, if a laboratory wants to get a permit from the Department of Health, they have to have a proper lab director, and that's defined in regulation. Generally, it's an MD or PhD, and then they have to have appropriate experience in forensic DNA testing. And then the laboratory itself has to provide documentation that it has a quality management system and that it has SOPs that are based on proper validations that have been done. And at New York State Department of Health, we actually approve the laboratory in a specific category, but we also approve the methods. So they are not allowed to do testing on New York State samples until a particular method has been approved, and that involves our review of their validation of that method. To the extent possible, we try and hold the forensic identity labs to the same standards that the Commission uses, so FBI standards or something more stringent. Those standards are not always completely applicable, and we recognize that.
And can I ask a question? How much do you follow AABB? Because you mentioned an MD or PhD, and that's something that they require.
Right. So we actually have a separate permit category for paternity.
Okay.
And they do align themselves with AABB. And also, if they're doing paternity testing for forensic identity, we ask them to follow those standards as well.
So under the permit, there's, I'd say, criminal forensics and relationship forensics. Is that how you? Are there two different tracks under that?
We don't call paternity identity criminal. So if it's a, so for example, if it's a rape or incest or something, and there are criminal charges involved, then it comes under the forensic identity permit.
Forensic identity,
But
okay.
for immigration purposes or paternity or child custody issues, that's the paternity permit. I should say category, sorry. You get a permit, and then you have categories that allow you to work in different areas.
Okay.
So, one other thing that is a little bit different about New York is there's a law that specifies who's allowed to order and receive the results of tests if they're considered a clinical test. And so, for example, private investigators aren't allowed to submit samples for forensic identity testing on New York State samples. So our website actually has a link to a list of approved professions that can authorize testing and receive the test results. And largely that relates more to the clinical arena, but there are also on there, police departments, obviously, and so forth. Originally, when we were operating in the early 2000s, we had, I think, 13 commercial labs that were permitted, but through basically most of it has been through mergers. We're down to 2. So right now, the 2 labs that have a permit in forensic identity from the New York State Department of Health are Miter Typing Technologies and Bodie Cellmark. We do have, I would say, maybe 3 or 4 labs that are in discussions about obtaining a forensic identity permit and are at various stages, kind of learning what the process is and what they need. But they're not in applied status at this time. And one of the common questions we get is, well, once you apply, how long does it take? And it really does depend, not surprisingly, on the quality of the lab, the quality of the validations. Have they, do they have them well written up and summarized, and do they have all their ducks in a row in terms of staff and training and competency tests and so forth. So we're now facing this new model, which we call distributive testing. So classically in the past, testing has involved one laboratory that's pretty much responsible from the beginning to the end in terms of receiving the evidence and reporting out and testifying. And now we're faced with this issue where, and it's not even just in forensics, it's also happening in cancer and molecular genetics, where there's a high quality wet lab, if you will, that has high throughput capabilities and can generate good data. And then there are very specialized bioinformatics folks who operate at a different company, want to use the data from the first company, analyze it with their different algorithms and provide that data. But in the case of genetic genealogy, we also have the third component, which is a public database, which allows us to try and obtain leads in that case. So this is new for us, and we are in the process of deciding how we can do this so that we don't put unrealistic burdens on a lab, for example, that does a 850,000 SNP panel, which is advertised and marketed as a cancer SNP panel, but actually can be used for forensics. So we don't want that wet lab to have to jump through all of the hoops that they would have to for a forensics lab necessarily. So what we're considering is, finding the appropriate category for the wet lab. So is it molecular genomics, is it cancer oncology, or is it forensics, depending on what they're proposing to do. And then we'll try and work with them so that they get a permit as well. So like I said, it's new to us. We have to figure out a way to have the whole process validated. And one of the proposals has been to use some of the standardized genomes that are out there for such purposes. And one of the things we've been actually looking at is whether there are disclaimers on those, because the people who agreed to have their DNA be part of this probably never thought that at any point in time someone could actually find out their identity and associate their identity with their genome information in a very public manner. And there is a paper recently where, and I don't recall the authors, but just for fun, a group decided to see if they could find out the identity of someone who had participated in a cancer research project, and they did. So we're approaching this very carefully because obviously it's a very sensitive issue. It's very new. GEDmatch has put on their website, a warning that anybody who submits their data there could be open to examination for law enforcement purposes, and that they have the right to remove their data if they choose to. But again, how many people read the fine print when they agree to software analysis is questionable.
One of the many companies that offers SNP panel testing has signed a multi-million-dollar agreement with GlaxoSmithKline to share the SNP data. So when someone gives a saliva or cheek swab to one of the labs to find out what part Armenian am I or Venezuelan, those data are being sold to other companies, and that's in the fine print.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's
you mentioned Parabon. Parabon doesn't actually have a wet lab, as you know. They send the sample out to another lab and get a BAM file and then crunch the data.
Correct.
And many of these companies will send you a list on your laptop of the 800 or 2,000 potential relatives. Are they first cousins, second cousins? And if they've clicked the right button, and if you've clicked the right button, you can trade emails and have a family gathering.
Right.
So it's, I think 20 million people have paid to have their DNA tested by one of about a dozen companies. Over 20 million now. Probably quite a few from New York State.
A million in GEDmatch last I looked. So that's sort of where we are. I know there's a lot of interest, especially because of all the cases solved in the past year, using this approach. But it is going to take us a little while to work through this, so hopefully folks will be patient with us.
Very helpful. Questions?
You mentioned approving technology. Technology is rapidly changing.
Sure is.
Obviously, SNP chips are being used, but they're not being used in forensic applications yet.
Right.
Sequencing is being used in some of these companies, but not yet in forensics. going to be involved in getting those new methodologies accepted?
Right, so for us, we have the luxury of being at the Wadsworth Center, which is both a public health lab, a research lab, a regulatory entity. And because of that, we have staff that are doing, whole genome sequencing and next-gen sequencing, and have been for a few years working on various different projects related to, in particular, to infectious disease. So we certainly have personnel that help us with what we should expect in terms of validations of those technologies. And then my understanding is that even if they go to sequencing, they'll still be basically generating the fragment length data, because that's the CODIS database is based on that. So my understanding is that we won't be going to a sequence level, looking at SNP polymorphisms in terms of what's entered into the national DNA system. But if that changes, we'll roll with it and figure out how to handle it.
Of course, I'm well known for saying that capillary electrophoresis or anything is obsolete technology when you're only using length.
Yeah, there's more information there, for sure. But it's hard, it's a big system, it's a big ship to steer, so.
So what are the repercussions for a lab like Parabon or your private investigator if they do this without your authority?
Yeah, not my best. So it is essentially the laboratory that's performing the testing that gets penalized. And so they can be charged with either a misdemeanor or fines, and I don't know what those fines are, but I think it's based on every day of illegal testing. So when we hear of any lab, because obviously if there are labs in other states, they wouldn't necessarily know what we require in New York. So we try and inform them that they're not allowed to test New York State samples, and they, at that point, sort of assess their business model and decide whether it's worth getting a permit for New York or not.
And what constitutes a New York State sample? Is that a sample collected in the state?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are there instances where those charges have been levied against labs outside of New York and were successfully?
There are, I believe. I don't know that it was against any forensics lab, but again, we have a big operation and we oversee a lot of clinical testing in a lot of different categories. So
it's complicated.
Yeah,
across state lines.
Yeah, it is.
Well, to be clear, is there any statute or reg in place at this moment that would stop a police officer in Pulaski, New York, from sending a crime scene sample on his or her own to Parabon?
Parabon would be at risk. So it's the
based
lab.
on existing public law?
It's a public health law that we operate under.
I see.
So we only have authority over the laboratories.
But if a sample goes to Parabon, they're not the wet lab.
Correct.
So Parabon would send the sample to whoever they use as
Right.
a wet lab.
And so both parties would be subject to repercussions.
And then what, a lot of times I would think this evidence would not even be entered into court if it's just for investigative leads. It might not get to court, but what if that investigator tried to submit the evidence to court? Is there anything in that process that would prevent the evidence from being submitted?
That would not come under our authority. It would alert us as to the fact that it had been done, and we would have a conversation with the laboratory. But we can't, that's not our.
And then what labs are exempt from this? Did you say police or government labs or public labs?
Yeah, so for our purposes, it's state and local government officials and labs. There's also exemptions for like doctors' offices and a list of other things, but they don't really relate to us.
My sense is that a company like Parabon would not I don't know how much validation information you would want from them, but they're not very disclosing of their methods. So is your sense that would automatically preclude them if they, what minimally could they provide you while still protecting their intellectual property?
I think it'll be the proof is in the pudding sort of a validation, where we ask them to show us evidence that the whole system works from, wherever the evidence originates from, through the wet lab, through the bioinformatics lab, and then look at what kind of report they generate and how carefully they interpret their findings and that sort of thing.
Let me offer a hypothetical and see if I'm still troubled. There's pipe bombs are put up around New York State, and ATF is called in, and DEA and the FBI, the three-letter agencies that assist local and state police, and they really want to get a profile on the person who, there's common fingerprints and common DNA, and there's a 13 locus STR match, so we know we're dealing with one guy, but does he have red hair or blue eyes or freckles? This is important to know as the profilers develop the profile. Are we hearing that New York public law would prevent DEA or ATF from using Parabon to find a dangerous person?
So one of the exempt entities is the federal government. So we don't have authority over, for example, what the FBI would want to do. But since you brought it up, what's your opinion of phenotype analysis right now in terms of?
Well, I think Manfred Kaiser's papers are quite compelling with regard to eye color, and they're improving them, actually. I've seen some recent papers that have been submitted. I'm a reviewer of one of them, but the ancestry thing is a bit complicated because the companies are using 50 samples from Baku in Azerbaijan and 30 samples from Zagreb and 14 samples from Regina, Saskatchewan. And they're telling people that you're 13%, whatever. And my students are asking me, how come the numbers change? I'm getting an update, and now I'm only 4% this or that. Well, their sample sizes change, their sampling methods change, and we have to remember what Ken Kidd's taught us, and David Reich's new book, Who We Are and How We Got Here, about human migration. So the people that have been sampled in Baku, for example, they may not have always been there over the history of time. Humans have been migrating from west to east and east to west, and 8% of parts of Europe are directly derived from Genghis Khan. So these numbers are a little bit like smoke and mirrors, and they change as sampling methods improve and as more populations are sampled.
Right.
So but some of the phenotype prediction I think is quite strong. I'd be concerned that the regulatory aspects of your important work don't interfere with the compelling needs of law enforcement. So I think this is a tightrope that you're walking in your agency.
It is, but after 9/11, we had the same requirements, and we, as quickly as we could, got 3 commercial labs that offered to be involved in identifications permitted. So if we stuck to our guns then, I would say we probably would stick to our guns in the future. But I'm not the final authority on that, for sure.
So again, not to belabor the issue, but one way around this issue that your organization is confronting would be for the local police officer in Oswego, New York, to simply get a federal agency involved.
I'll double check with our legal staff, but that seems reasonable if the federal government is willing to.
If it's a compelling enough case.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, we do not regulate the FBI. The FBI government lab working on New York State samples or anything like that.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Still under old business, we'll address next generation sequencing now. The letter we received on our page 428, the BioTwig. Yeah. Did everyone get a chance to read the letter from comments or questions about that letter and the direction here in New York?
I have a couple of comments. So the first challenges are time and money, and I completely agree that those are very challenging issues. There are a few comments about no existing guidance, e.g. SWGDAM, for validation or mixture interpretation. In 2016, in December of 2016, the SWGDAM validation guidelines were updated to include some components that address validating sequencing systems, specifically for the new sequencing systems. So with what we knew at that time, in 2016, we did update that document. I expect that will continue. There are no guidance documents, as far as I know, about mixture interpretation of the sequence data. So I definitely do still see that as an issue. I haven't seen any probabilistic genotyping that's been tuned specifically for the sequence data. And my sense is from developers of that software, people who are researching it, that we may need to tune that software specifically to the sequence data. And SWGDAM has not tackled that, nor has anyone else, as far as I know, as far as providing guidance on that. There is an interpretation document that is in progress right now through the system in SWGDAM that is interpretation, the Autosomal STR interpretation document. It's an addendum to that existing document that addresses sequencing in a binary system. That is certainly not harnessing the full power of the sequence data if you're trying to interpret it in a binary system. Certainly think that we need probabilistic genotyping to really use that data effectively. But that document, I expect it will come out perhaps in Q1 of 2019. But there will be some interpretation guidance, very minimal on mixtures. You know, this is what you might see in a two-person mixture with sequence data. It might help you resolve stutter. You might see isometric alleles, isoalleles. But it's certainly not the type of mixture guidance that I think is really needed. So I agree with that part of the statement. I don't necessarily agree with the lack of guidance on validation. And then the next point was that there are no existing standards, e.g. FBI QAS or approved kits for NGS. The SWGDAM NGS working group did read through the revision that's going through right now of the QAS, and we looked at it to see if there was anything that needed to be added or changed specific to sequence data, so that anything that's necessary in there will be incorporated into the revision of the QAS. That should also come out, I think, early next year. And then as far as approved kits for NGS through ENDIS, there's a package right now that was submitted quite a while ago, maybe a year ago, for Forensic to allow the length-based STR alleles that are back calculated from the sequence data to go into ENDIS. So it's still a length-based profile, but it's been generated from the sequencing. And I am not a part of that process, but my sense is that that too will be approved in the near future. So that data will be, I expect it will be acceptable at ENDIS in the near future. And I think that that also required Doug Hayers to submit a letter to Congress letting them know that the FBI was considering this, allowing this, and that they have a period to respond to that. And I don't think he's gotten any response, and the period may have already closed. So I don't think that there's anything, I think that the ENDIS board is waiting for the SWGDAM board to approve the autosomal STR interpretation addendum before ENDIS approves the length-based alleles from sequence data. But these things are happening. They're kind of falling into place. So, you know, I don't know if the BioTwig or anybody would like to have some more information on what is available or what's in the pipeline, but I'd be happy to provide that to whoever might be interested in it. There are also a number of nomenclature documents. That's not actually cited in here. I was surprised to see that no one said there's no nomenclature for STR sequence data, because that's the number one thing that I tend to hear, that's the roadblock. And there are a number of guidance documents on that, and we at NIST are working on at least nailing down the framework and trying to get that information to the manufacturers so that they're all reporting the sequence data in the same format so that labs using different platforms can converse with each other. And if this does ever go to NDIS, there's already a framework for what that data should look like. So that's in progress as well. So, I mean, I think in the very near future, when the NDIS when the NDIS package is approved, labs that want to could be using the forensic kit to generate sequence-based STR alleles. I don't see any roadblocks other than the time and money to doing that in the near future.
Can I ask, just what was the purpose of this? Is this just the purpose of this memo? Was it from the meeting last time when you started to talk about this that you asked for input from the labs as to what they thought about the new technology?
We did.
Okay.
This body requested information.
Okay. I think that I hesitate to have rapid DNA and next-gen sequencing lumped together because they're very different technologies, and I think that it's important for a whole host of reasons that we not lump those together and try to keep them separate whenever possible. I mean, that may have been a request here, and that's why it's here, but I think in moving forward, it's important to keep those separate.
I completely agree, and I thought the request had to do specifically with next gen.
It did.
Yeah.
Okay.
Other comments or questions? Dr. Sozer? Yeah, go ahead.
The purpose here was to find out where the labs in New York State stood on all these technologies, new technologies, specifically next gen. So a lot of these comments are what comments are coming from the individual laboratories. So thank you for updating, and I was aware of a lot of those initiatives, but I didn't want to put down everything in here. I wanted to respond to put down what the actual labs were talking about and where they stood and what they felt were the challenges.
Okay, that makes sense. Yep. So if there's any, I mean, I think this tells me that the SWGDAM working group needs to be doing a better job of outreach. But if there's any specific thing that you could recommend that I could go back to the SWGDAM working group with, that we could do for outreach, maybe the code administrators, some type of newsletter or something like that.
And of course, Eugene and I are both on BioTwig, so and we're on SWGDAM, so we're going to take some of this back, obviously. Thank you for your comments. Appreciate it.
Anything else?
No, I just think that that I think the rapid DNA systems have other applications besides just arrestee booking, and I just want to be careful with this memo that I guess it's focused on, this is from a meeting and people's ideas, put down on paper that it shouldn't be taken. I don't think it's going to take 5 to 10 years in general to validate rapid DNA. And I think that there's some initiatives with the ASCLD and mass fatality response that where New York could really benefit from the use of rapid DNA moving forward.
And I think the fun thing is came from the smaller labs who don't have the resources, the money, the personnel. That's what they were indicating.
Yeah.
It did not address the larger labs that may be able to do that much quicker. Okay, thank you. We'll now move on to new business. On page 275 of your binder, there's a letter from the New York City Police Department requesting to appear before the subcommittee regarding rapid DNA testing. Deputy Chief Katronicus, welcome. Deputy Chief Katronicus wanted to address the subcommittee at this time. Morning.
Yeah, before Chief Kazanakis speaks, I just want to introduce myself. I'm Assistant Chief Jason Wilcox. I oversee the investigative support group of the Detective Bureau. An important part of that group is Chief Kazanakis' Forensic Investigation Division. So it's a privilege for me to be here to sit with you a little bit this morning. A very important element of our success has been, embracing and utilizing new technologies, and we're continually exploring, to utilize new possibilities, new investigative tools in our efforts to build better cases, stronger investigations, and hopefully solve crimes. So, we look forward to, again, working with this committee as we move forward down the road with new technologies, and Chief Kazanakis is going to elaborate on that point, but I just want to thank you for allowing me to be here this morning.
Chief Kazanakis, I see that I have butchered your name. I apologize.
Not the first, you won't be the last. Good morning. On the heels of Chief Wilcox, I want to say thank you for taking the time and giving us this opportunity. So, in response to a letter from New York State Division of Criminal Justice Services to the Police Commissioner of the City of New York, dated April 22nd, 2016, I'm here today to tell you that the NYPD is determined to develop and implement a rapid DNA testing platform, primarily to enhance our forensic capability portfolio. So we recognize that rapid DNA testing is a valuable tool that can provide investigative leads that are both inculpatory and exculpatory. We also recognize the limited capabilities of rapid DNA testing and fully understand that rapid DNA testing will not replace conventional DNA testing conducted by our public accredited CODIS laboratory. So currently we're in the information gathering phase. We're collaborating very closely with our partners at the Office of Chief Medical Examiner's Forensic Biology Laboratory. We're communicating with other jurisdictions and other agencies throughout the United States of America that have a rapid DNA testing platform. We're evaluating what we're learning. We're looking at various business models and taking this information back to the table and continuing to discuss, develop, create draft policies and procedures as we move forward. We do intend on developing and validating a testing method. We intend on creating a formal and comprehensive training program that includes written and practical competency examinations. We also intend on developing specific policies and procedures that will affect the holistic aspect of rapid DNA testing. So it's not simply the operation of an instrument. There is a holistic perspective to take into consideration with field personnel, the collection of samples, and the ultimate transfer of those samples to a rapid DNA testing unit to perform the operation, perform the analysis, report out that data based on what we learned from the test. So we anticipate, although this is not a concrete timeline, it's a very loose deadline, beginning casework once we've completed all of those features that I've mentioned to you regarding method validation and training at the latter part of 2019, quite possibly the earlier part of 2020. But of course, that's subject to change. So with that, I'd like to ask you if you have any suggestions, recommendations, thoughts that you can share with us as the subject matter experts, as the academic experts that bring a hell of a lot to the table. For lack of a better phrase, esteemed professionals, what can you offer us as we move forward with our planning to develop a rapid platform?
I have a couple of questions, Chief. Do you have any idea how many of the units you might lease or purchase, and where would they be physically located? For example, would any of the major medical centers to do the typing at the time the nurse examiners do the rape kits?
Just so I understand your question, so
How many of the rapid DNA instruments do you envision having available, and where would they be physically located?
several instruments, and they would be located in the NYPD's Forensic Investigations Division, in
So
the
the-
NYPD facility.
Not out in the field?
Not out
in Watertown, New York?
Not in Watertown, no, sir.
And not in any hospitals?
Not in any hospital, not at this time.
I see.
So what evidence will you, is this crime scene evidence that you're going to be processing on rapid DNA for a local database search, or how is it going to be, how is it going to be used?
So it's a compounded question. So let me just start off with the first part is yes, we will be collecting. We intend on collecting crime scene samples and testing those crime scene samples in rapid DNA testing. So let me just present a caveat that won't be all crime scene samples, very specific types of crime scene samples. And we'll also be testing buccal reference swabs.
What kind of crime scene samples are specific?
Again, we're in the information gathering phase, so it wouldn't be appropriate for me to give you potential scenarios or specific types of samples. We're in the process of developing a policy and procedure. I'm happy to hear if you have any recommendations for us.
I'm not sure why you wouldn't at least consider having a unit in Plattsburgh, one in Erie County, one in Hempstead, and one in the Poconos, or, just geographically distributed so that they don't have to all go to Albany.
I think I can answer your question. We're NYPD police officials, so our jurisdiction is the 5 counties of the city of New York.
Okay.
So I'm not sure why
You're not,
mentioning-
so you're not thinking statewide? You're only dealing with the 5 boroughs?
5 boroughs.
All right.
Yeah, I think one of the considerations was brought up when the OCMU mentioned their interest in doing this, that the use of it on crime scene samples would make it such that those profiles would not be eligible to go into the state or national database. So, yeah, on the crime scene evidence. And so you would need to have a local database or be doing direct matches within a case. So you already have a case where you have a suspect that you're trying to match to. Right? Does that make sense? So that really limits a lot of the use cases. There are some jurisdictions around the country that are setting up, the police chief has decided they want to do this, and the federal government doesn't have really any stick in it. It doesn't have a way to stop them from doing it. If they're not a laboratory that submits samples to the national database, then there's nothing really to prevent them from doing it. So they set up, it's called Small Pond Database, where they can put in their own individuals. So is that what you're thinking, or are you thinking more in an individual case?
We're considering all options. We're looking at all business models, various jurisdictions, law enforcement agencies. I can tell you that we are the largest law enforcement agency. So what would be the appropriate business model for smaller agencies, what would be the most appropriate for PD? I know there's this conversation about end this. And I can tell you that we've realized a great deal of success with CME outside of this. So we're certainly looking at more
Would one of those options be the system you actually use? Right now, you're not considering or worrying about possibly Indus or CODIS, but the FBI has validated, has determined a system for use and possibly not others for use within Indus? Or are you looking ahead to possibly one day overcoming that so that you're now using a system that can be uploaded to Indus if that becomes necessary?
Undoubtedly, we're forward thinking. So the chief of laboratories for the OCME and I have had multiple conversations about the available technologies, about forward thinking in the future, not just next year, the year after, but 2025 and so on. So without a doubt, it would be ideal if at some point, as you specifically stated, we could overcome this. I don't think this is something the NYPD can overcome. I think that's more of a national concept, whether or not samples that we collect and analyze today could be subsequently uploaded in the far future into Indus. I'm not sure if and when that day will come, but what we do feel at this time is that this is a powerful investigative tool that we want to exploit. So we are moving forward, we're determined to move forward, we're going to do it right, we're going to take into consideration quality assurance, we're going to take into consideration feedback, scientific counsel from the Forensic Biology Laboratory here in New York City, as well as others out in the national community that I'm in touch with. We're visiting other agencies, gathering information, we're learning more, we're working in a very deliberate, specific way so that we come up with the best way to do business. But again, I want to kind of turn it to you and ask you, in addition to your questions, which I'm very pleased to listen to and answer, I find them very important, what can you tell us to give us some sense of a blueprint or guidelines as an esteemed group of professionals? What specifically can you state or recommendations or suggestions on your part as the DNA subcommittee to the NYPD to bring back to our plan table?
Are you validating it in the NYPD lab or in the OCME lab, or where are you actually validating the instrument?
We're currently not validating. Our plans to validate are, of course, with the instruments that we intend on using and the environment that we plan on doing testing. And we're looking at all the various features that one would expect to come out of a validated method. We're still gathering information on what's best and what's appropriate. Do you have any thoughts that you can offer us on what we should do?
Well, you're going to validate it in a lab. Which lab is OCM? I mean, because Office of the Forensic Biology Lab is also validating rapid DNA, right? Are you doing it together or planning to do it together?
So the NYPD is going to validate the rapid DNA instrument in an NYPD facility.
Okay.
But conceptually, we're going to be working together, listening to what the OCME has to offer as far as scientific counsel. We're looking at a concordance study, which we feel is an important component. So analyses that we conduct on samples using the rapid instrument that we select, we're going to ask for the OCME to go ahead and do conventional testing and, of course, do a comparative analysis and learn more about the capability and limitations of rapid.
And then you would use validation, SWGDAM validation guidelines, or?
Well, bear in mind there are no SWGDAM validation guidelines.
They're working
for
up
rapid
to it.
testing. I do believe that some.
Yeah.
There are, but they're meant for laboratories that are accredited under the quality assurance guidelines. So they're not meant for police laboratories or booking station applications. There was a task group that met just last week that was having this conversation. Okay, good, good, okay, good. I was going to ask that.
But I don't believe, my understanding is there are not specific SWGDAM guidelines for rapid DNA testing, unless you know otherwise.
And I think, Allison, you have to look at what's the use. Is it going to go into CODIS? Is it for investigative leads? And then, kind of look at that. I mean, I commend you to come in and ask this question to make sure that I don't know what this group covers or what we don't. If this is in our swim lane or not. If it's in our swim lane, then I think we'd want to make sure that we have guidelines so that there's no moving target as you're moving forward. And I think I applaud you for looking at the newest technologies. I mean, all of us as taxpayers have paid into this technology through our taxes to the federal government, to DOD, to DHS, to DOJ in developing this technology. And, this is often the hardest part, is transitioning a technology into operation. So I think whatever this group can do to support that would be great. Just in preparing for this meeting, knowing this topic was going to come up, there are numbers of agencies around the U.S. that are starting to do this. I have a list. You probably have that same list, but to look at some of their lessons learned and build on those lessons learned, so you can do it faster, better, cheaper. And
you're not reinventing the wheel, and you can avoid the things that didn't work out.
No, and I think, Fred, your comment is very intriguing, and I think in a year or so that will probably be a topic that we're going to want to discuss as a committee, because I think there's a lot of applicability in that area. But I think whatever we can do to help, it's the technology's come a long way. It's a robust technology, and I mean, that's Mandy Sozer's opinion on it, and I think to try to embrace that where it fits, in the application that it fits, where it can be done can yield informative results that are accurate.
Just from my dealings, obviously with forensic investigations division, methodology, practical application, quality control are absolute priorities in his world. So as we move down the road, all of these things will be coming into play with that as well.
Catherine, maybe you could fill in some of this. Why cannot these profiles be uploaded?
And Mandy, you can probably do this better than me, actually. But so there is now an Audits, which is the Rapid DNA Index System. I'm not sure if it's active yet, but it's either it is or it's about to be. Do you know?
Yeah, I think the issue, is so you have single source profiles, and then you have question profiles or evidence profiles, and in order to upload. And really, the FBI should be here talking, right. But at some point, we might want that. But in order to, in the processing of the question or unknown samples, you need to quantitate that DNA. And right now, the methods that are used in the testing in the rapid DNA machines, the FBI feels that those quantitative methods are not what they intended for in the standard. So if you have a bead technology where you actually are, in essence, quantitating the amount of DNA or whatever technology you're using, the FBI doesn't feel like that fits with their standards, so those samples can't be uploaded.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a kind of a convenient technicality to point to as to why you can't do it, and there are a lot of other reasons that maybe are underlying that. The systems. So what's going to go into Audits are single source profiles from suspects, not evidence samples. The systems, from what I see, I don't actively work in this area, but obviously people in our lab do, and from what I see, they work very well, very robust on single source samples. That's what they're tuned to do, which is right. In a booking station, you could quickly search the person that just got booked. You could quickly search them and see if you should hold them or not. For evidence samples that are going to require a degree of interpretation, then you might want a scientist there, right? Unless the expert software can interpret that mixture with no scientist involved, then there's a danger there with mixture interpretation or misinterpretation of a mixture sample at the crime scene.
Although I would think you could tell whether it's a good single source sample or potentially a mixture.
Yes, and I think some of the software is tuned to reject the sample outright. You would never see a result if it is a mixture. or you could tell the software to do that for you. But I would think some of the point in doing it would be.
Thinking of the comment on blood spatter, you know, sometimes you can find blood that you're reasonably confident is not admixed.
Yes.
And a single source sample.
Yes.
But Ken and Catherine and Chief, New York State isn't yet taking DNA on arrest, is it?
No.
No. So, how could one take DNA at booking? You can't in New York State, can
I think they were just talking in in theory. Yeah,
Generalities.
just generalities.
Right.
Yeah. Will that change? Is that going to change in New York?
Are there any
Have to change the law?
or anything that you're aware of?
Anybody working on that?
Not that I'm aware of at this time. I think it would require legislation.
Okay.
So you addressed the April 16th, 2016 letter. I assume that letter touched somehow the subcommittee on rapid DNA. There was a letter that went out a couple of years ago. Does anything need to be done? Is that letter an impediment, or does that need to be reevaluated?
It's February 22nd, I just spoke.
February 22nd, 2016? Okay.
Go ahead.
I'm Bill Fitzpatrick, a member of the Forensic Science Commission. Am I allowed to ask questions?
Sure.
Okay.
Bill, you want to talk to the
Oh, okay. Good morning, everybody. Just to reintroduce myself, Bill Fitzpatrick. I'm the DA in Syracuse. And to either gentleman, Chief, is the validation process you're undergoing, is it going to involve actual crime scene sampling?
I understand your question. So are you asking whether or not we're going to collect or use evidence from cases crime scene response to in the validation? We're looking into every vein to ensure that.
So hypothetically, you have a neighborhood that's suffering a serial burglar or sex offender, and NYPD responds to the scene, collects a sample, brings it to the location at NYPD. I'm not sure where that's going to be, but an analysis would be then done of that and develop a suspect profile.
Post-method validation, right, where we feel that the rapid DNA instrument is ready for casework, and we approve the casework and we move forward. That is a potential and hypothetical scenario. I cannot commit to it that would be a situation where we would in fact roll out rapid DNA testing. That's yet to be determined.
Right, and there's no question that there's an immediacy to identify the suspect. What I'm concerned about, though, is that if you develop that profile and then attempt to use that as a basis of the prosecution as to whether or not that would be admissible in court under current law, I don't see how it would be, because you're testing it at a non-accredited lab. It might not even be tested by scientists.
Is that a question or statement?
It's kind of an observation to see your reaction as to whether or not you see that difficulty as a difficulty, or whether you don't see that as a difficulty.
Undoubtedly, the impact of court is something that we take very seriously. We're going to work with our partners, DA's offices.
I'm on your side. I get the impression like I feel like Barry Schechter all of a sudden. I've been fighting him for 15 years, but I'm on your side. I just don't see how. Are you?
So let me put it like this. So you've been around the block a few times, and undoubtedly new technologies are introduced into the criminal justice system at the beginning of time, right? And they've always been tested by the court system and either accepted or not accepted. Some have went through some very difficult roads. Some have been less difficult with less obstacles and less pain. So I think that's about as far as I'm going to go with my comments. So yes, this is something new. It's going to be introduced. I don't know if this is the appropriate venue to talk about what will or won't be discoverable or accepted. Is this the place to do that?
Well, let me start with the February 22nd letter that you mentioned, 2016. That letter came from Brian Gestring to your commissioner. And in there it says that agencies seeking to adopt rapid DNA must appear before the New York State DNA Subcommittee to discuss how they intend to implement this technology. What's interesting to me is that's where it stops. That's where the letter stops. It doesn't go on and say anything beyond appearing for the subcommittee to discuss how they intend to implement the technology. So I think there's a big question mark out there that still needs to be resolved within the state of New York as to your implementation, your validation, and is this the appropriate body to oversee, approve, etc. To me, this letter doesn't address that, and I'll just leave it at that.
Dwight, it's Mike Green. Do you mind if I just add a quick?
Suggesting a platform or a road forward. My suggestion would be, it's only suggestions, that NYPD coordinate with the DNA subcommittee on how you intend to validate this. And I'd also strongly recommend that you have the input from 5 borough DAs and their DNA experts so that ultimately the product can get its way into court. Because, God forbid you consume inadvertently or advertently consume the only sample at the scene. If it's a technology in use that I can't get into court, it's a little comfort to me to know who did it, and I'm sure you feel the same way. So that would be my suggestion, that a blueprint be established and that you work with this group and 5 borough DAs.
Just in terms of process, I mean, that's what we do. We collaborate on a host of issues, and
so you do it
as we
for 20 years, yeah.
Right, and that's one of our, I think, one of our strongest points as an agency. We're very open to collaboration and coordination with non-NYPD entities, including the district attorney's office, and we work closely with them. When I was in the Bronx detectives, I worked very closely with Ray Valerio over in the Bronx DA's office regarding DNA. So that's not going to stop. And as a matter of fact, when you have any kind of new emerging technology where you have to explore everything, actually the collaboration is so critical. So that's absolutely going to be a point that will be an important element of what we're doing. Absolutely.
Thank you for your
Thanks. Thank you for the opportunity.
I think Commissioner Green is going to be calling in, but Ken, go ahead.
I would like to commend the NYPD for following up on what that letter said. But I think we, as the DNA subcommittee, need to get our act together to find out why we want them to come and what we want to learn, if we are, in fact, the appropriate body.
Sorry, we have to call Mike. Hi, Mike. Can you hear us?
Yeah, I'm on 2 lines right now. I'm on the other line. I just think you hear me.
I think he's getting feedback.
Is there another number we should call you at that's clearer?
I'm on the line right now listening to your meeting on a different line. So I think you have that line muted.
I'm not sure. I think we'll have to connect through the phone, maybe. Try now. I don't think he's on the video. No. We don't have you on the video on this end.
Can you hear me now?
I think he went off the video when it wasn't working, so he's just dialed in.
Okay, this is the way it go.
Now we'll go to the next step.
What?
What we wasn't sure if he's working before. Oh, okay. Well. Right, that's.
Did you have a question that you wanted to ask? If we have you on this phone, we can't get the video camera to pick you up, to hear you. Commissioner?
While we're attempting to get Commissioner Green on the line, Ann, you wanted to make a quick statement.
Yeah, thanks. I just am thinking through things, and I wanted to clarify. I know that the genetic genealogy approach is a really sensitive, time-sensitive issue to folks. So my answer with respect to whether or not we have authority over a federal agent submitting to Parabon, for example, a sample that was coming from New York State was based upon earlier decisions where we were asked if we had authority over, for example, the FBI sanctioned mitotyping labs. And we determined that if a laboratory was approved by the FBI to do mitotyping, that we would not have authority over that. I'm not sure that that's the same as saying we don't have authority over a federal agent. So what I'd like to do is take that back to our legal team and get their opinion on it. And then once I have that clear, I can communicate that to BCJS and to the DNA subcommittee, so that there's no misunderstandings on my part, seeing as I'm not a lawyer. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Are you saying that the local New York State agency, NYPD, SPD, doesn't matter, cannot send a biological sample to Parabon?
Yes, at this point in time, if it's a state or local entity, so if it's a New York State investigative unit, the law would apply that if it's a non-government lab, they would need a permit from the Department of Health. So Parabon.
Parabon needs a permit from the Department of Health.
Yes.
Okay.
If it's submitted by local, county, state.
Each time, or just one permit for?
No, the process is you get a permit, and as long as you maintain standards, you retain that permit.
So they have to apply for a permit, and then we could submit it.
Yes. Okay. Thanks for letting me just clarify that.
Try to call again.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, can you hear us?
Yeah, I've been listening to you all along. Someone sent me a call-in number, and I've been on the phone the whole time. You just can't hear me. You must have had me muted.
Okay. Well, we can hear you now. So.
Yeah, that's because I'm on the cell phone now. But I was on my desk phone on a call-in line. The only thing I wanted to add is Brian's letter was written the way it was intentionally at the direction of the Commission on Forensic Science, and I believe with input from the DNA subcommittee. And the reason it was left open is, as I recall the discussions of the Commission, there was a feeling that Section 995 of the Executive Law could very well have application to rapid DNA used by a entity that could be deemed a laboratory, either someone who's from the state or from a unit of local government. Now, if it's used by a police department, there are police department labs, the NYPD lab, the Westchester County lab. does it matter if it's in the physical lab building or if it's done out on the street? And I think the thought was at the time that rather than try and decide those things in a vacuum and say, yes, it's covered or no, it's not, the more prudent course of action would be if some police agency decided they wanted to use it, to have them appear initially in front of the DNA subcommittee, explain to the DNA subcommittee exactly how they intended to use it and under what circumstances, so that we could then have an intelligent discussion grounded in some facts as to whether or not it fell within 995 of the executive law and required approval of the DNA subcommittee and ultimately the Commission on Forensic Science. So I would like to echo whoever it was that thanked the NYPD for providing notice for coming in, and would just reiterate that before anyone actually uses rapid DNA, I think it's very important that the showing discussed in Brian's letter be made so that there can be a full airing of whether or not 995 of the executive law applies, and that can be done up front rather than after the fact when there might be some very negative consequences.
Thank you, Commissioner Green. My letter to Commissioner Green in November 25th of 2015 stated in part that the feeling of this subcommittee that it was premature to discuss regulation of this technology when it's unclear if anyone is currently using rapid DNA. That was 2015. Well, today it's different, and so it's clear that we have some work ahead of us to discuss whether or not we bring about or discuss regulations.
So are we saying it falls under section 995? So it falls under the DNA subcommittee?
The letter that I mentioned from Brian Gestron, that was February 22nd, 2016, states this: while there is clearly merit to rapid DNA, law enforcement agencies seeking to adopt this technology should be aware that tests, quote, that employ techniques to examine DNA derived from the human body for the purpose of providing information to resolve issues of identification, close quote, are covered by New York Executive Law 995.
Okay.
The answer is yes.
Yep. So I think we need to provide guidance so that we're not holding things up. And
well, it seems like there are at least three organizations in New York State now that are planning to move forward: the NYPD, the OCME, and Ray's group in Albany. So, are there more, Ray?
To my knowledge, that's it.
Yeah. So it makes sense to coordinate the efforts under the watch of this subcommittee.
Seems like it would be a lot easier, and there's definitely the technical expertise collectively for it. So.
I'll be at an OSAC meeting in December, the week of December 10th in Phoenix, Arizona, where this issue may be on the agenda. I'll learn what I can from that, bring it back.
Possibly a template that we can use is the same template we use for familial DNA, where a smaller group got together. Jill, I'm sure that Shelley or others can fill you in on that template of how we went through that process and then brought it before the subcommittee. And maybe that's what we should strive for here.
So the
I might
subcommittee,
make it.
I'm sorry.
the
Go ahead.
subcommittee would like to follow that same template, and you're requesting to do so? Is that
Well,
my understanding?
I certainly thought our last effort worked well.
Okay.
So the answer is yes.
So I could just make a friendly comment to, I guess, the American Society of Crime Lab Directors has a task force that's working on rapid DNA. So probably there, I think the biggest take home there is the idea of making sure the sample is split and not consumed. And the model there for those folks considering crime scene would be to treat it like a field test for drugs. It provides an investigative lead, but like a field test kit, doesn't go to court. But that split sample then has the opportunity to have full accreditation, scientists, mixture interpretation, all those things that may be a shortcoming of rapid. So you get essentially have your cake and eat it too, where you have a quick investigative lead, and then when necessary, you have to work with the system that is already tried and true. So that would be a model that I would just, the ASCLID group is putting forward in terms of something. Certainly, much more would be needed, but certainly something to consider that would have both ends covered. You have an established system of accreditation that we'd be done with the one sample, with the split sample. That would be covered.
Have they put that recommendation in writing, Ray?
I can have it put in writing in short order if necessary. It's in process, but certainly if there's need to be, ASCLID can come up with a position statement.
Any other comments or questions related to NYPD's efforts?
If I could again, Dwight, I apologize. I think Ray's comments just highlight what Brian was trying to get at in his letter and what I was trying to say, and that is that there are many different ways this could be used. And before any police department uses it and runs the risk of using it in violation of Section 995, I think it's important that they come in and give a detailed description to the DNA subcommittee in the first instance of exactly how they're going to use it. Because I think what Ray describes could be at one end of the spectrum. Uses that Bill Fitzpatrick alluded to at the other. And it's very important, at least putting my hat on as chair of the Commission on Forensic Science, from the Commission perspective, it's important that someone come in and lay out for us how they're going to use it and what they're going to do and what the parameters are before they just jump in and start using it.
Well, I think just to reinforce the points that we had made earlier, that we're at the very beginning of our exploring this sort of new technology and how we may apply it in the future. We're seeking comments, we're seeking advice and collaboration. But to reinforce the point, we are not at an application point right now.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. As I said, I certainly commend you for coming in at this point. I think, everyone would agree that, from many different sides, this work is incredibly important right now, in terms of solving crimes, holding people accountable, exonerating people, making sure we don't target the wrong people, just, from so many different perspectives. And so I think opency and transparency, and, again, I think you should be commended for coming forward, and we just encourage you to continue to do so.
No, I thank you for bringing that point about the exoneration, because that's certainly a significant element and part that we're very aware of, and we understand that will be an important part of the process.
Well, not only are you not at the point of application, neither is the subcommittee, and that's where we need to move next. Thank you for coming, both of you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
The next item under new business is a memorandum from Jill Dooley dated October 15th, 2018. Oh, I'm sorry.
I was just wondering, Commissioner, would you like to stay on the call?
You know, I'll just call back in on the number that I was in. That'll be easier.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. And my apologies for the technical problems here.
No problem.
So,
Thank you.
Dwight, are we going to then make a motion that we're going to take some steps forward, or we don't need to do that? Are we just going to move forward?
I don't mind taking a motion.
If we need to or not, I don't know what that
way.
is. Kind of the action items from this.
I don't think a formal motion's necessary at this point.
Okay.
I think the direction's clear. I think we can take it back and start that process. Take a look back at the familial search process that was commenced a couple of years ago and mirror that. So I don't believe any.
Okay, perfect.
The memo I mentioned, dated October 15th, 2018, dealt with the results from the DNA Databank security audits. And so I'll ask for that if we have any questions or comments of Jill related to that audit. It's on page 276.
I don't want to elaborate anymore. It sounded like from the tone of the memo that some of the labs weren't aware of the requirements. Is that right?
That's my
interpretation?
understanding, yes.
Okay.
Kathy actually conducted the audits.
In the audits that were conducted in 2015, they were done by our internal audit department in DCJS. And subsequent to that, there was a memo written in 2016 that was presented to the DNA subcommittee, which detailed was a recommendation that the labs change the way that they reviewed, modified, and deleted profiles, and gave specific requirements. So that was a public document. Additionally, there was discussions at the CODIS meeting and perhaps maybe even at the BioTwig, not sure about that, but those were not documented. So going forward, so it seems like when I went around for 2018 audits that some of the individuals were not aware of that memo.
Okay.
Or that memo that was presented to the DNA subcommittee. So I think we can do a better job of making sure that
Or at least getting
the lab
documentation,
directors get actually a
acknowledgement.
copy. So that was what that was for.
Other questions or comments? Hearing none, we'll move on to laboratory disclosures. There are no votes required. This is for informational purposes only. And we have members of the laboratories available if there are any questions. And we'll begin with the New York State Police. There are two sections, both in the original document as well as in the updated documents. Anything? Go ahead.
On the first item, this miscut, the root cause analysis is in progress, or?
Or the handling of the item that required both serology and gunshot residue?
Yes.
Yes, the corrective action is still in progress.
Okay.
How was the analyst originally instructed, the serologist originally instructed to not sample from that area? It says they were instructed, but it doesn't say.
The analyst, there was an email that was provided to the analyst supervisor that the analyst received a copy of in their case folder when they were assigned the case, and they were aware of it because they actually had questions associated with the instructions that were in that email. Because when they actually processed the case, they didn't follow those instructions.
So is there like a process of case review before the analyst goes to the bench and actually starts working on the item?
The analyst failed to seek clarification if they had any questions on this was it's not the type of sample we get typically that requires gunshot residue, so it was sort of unique, but there had already been discussions between the assistant director in the section with the submitting agency with respect to what they were looking for on that item. It was an item, a t-shirt that had been collected from a suspect in a case, and it had an apparent bullet hole in it, and there was also blood staining.
Mm-hmm.
So the serologist was supposed to collect a sample that would be away from the area of the possible bullet hole. That would allow DNA to help determine the identity of the person that was wearing the shirt. And the instruction was to take a sample that was away from that hole, bullet hole. And that's what was failed to be followed. So the analyst also had made a marking with a Sharpie type marker on the item. So between this, where the sample was collected, which was too close to the hole, as well as the marking that interfered with the subsequent gunshot residue. So both the agency and the district attorney's office were notified of that.
Other questions? Thank you. Next up, Suffolk County Crime Laboratory. Begins on page 280. Questions or comments? Hearing none, I'll move on to Westchester County. Begins on page 284.
Is anybody here from, I mean, this is,
Do we have someone here?
Westchester?
this was at our last meeting as well.
Yeah, there was an additional email that came a few days after your last meeting, so we have to provide you the
Oh,
documents,
okay.
but, yeah.
I don't really have any questions, so.
Okay. The next item on the agenda is the executive session. Can I have a motion to go into executive session to discuss matters relating to current investigations or matters that may lead to the appointment, promotion, discipline, or suspension of a particular person? Dr. Gettings, a second. Dr. Tozer, all in favor? Unanimous? At this point, if you're not a member of the DNA subcommittee, a member, or I would ask that you Okay, I'd like to go back on the record and report that no action was taken in executive session. Next meeting of the DNA subcommittee will be February 1st, 2019 in New York City. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
Are you on?
Dr. Gettings, do I have a second? Dr. Eastman, all in favor? Unanimous? Thank you very much.
Okay.